Okay, hi. Welcome back to Comparative. We're talking about the state. In the last snippet, we talked about what the state is and isn't, that sort of thing. This snippet, we're going to talk about the history of the state. We're going to start with sort of early proto-states, political organization as it in its beginnings, and then we're going to talk about the modern nation state. And by modern, we mean like several hundred years old. Okay, here we go. So states have been around for a long time when we define it broadly to include these earliest forms. We're talking 8,000 years old. We're talking about, Egypt, of course, which had an advanced civilization for thousands of years. But even before that, thousands of years before Egypt, there were advanced civilizations in the Middle East, Babylon, Sumer, places like that. Also, Latin America, we now know in the Americas, um, civilizations began earlier than we thought. We used to think that they were relatively recent based on the lack of a writing systems, but also an unearned certainty that humans had arrived in a rough but pretty specific time range. But now that it's much more unclear about when they arrived, and it's believed they arrived significantly earlier. Anyway, what did those states look like? Well, they first came into being in conjunction with urbanization, or the creation of cities. So the city and the state kind of developed at the same time. Which came first? Did all that organization develop because people were living together? So in other words, the city comes first and then the state develops? Or did the development of the state and all that organization encourage people to move to the cities? It's an interesting question. One thing I like to bring up is is it might have something to do with agriculture, the types of crops that were grown. Wheat versus yams, for example. Wheat, when we became agriculturally settled and we started growing wheat, that may have led to the development of the state and cities. Why? When we switched from growing something like yams, harvesting yams, to growing wheat. Why? Really weird, right? It definitely had something to do with it. Because yams, no, let's do it from the wheat end. Wheat and other grains grow really, really high. And they grow at certain times, and you harvest them at certain times. And it's very visible. Why does that matter? Because you can tax them. You can tax them easily. You know where the fields are, you know when the food's going to be there ready for harvest, and so a state, a government, what have you, can go in there and tax them. Now, taxes are money, but back in the day, taxes were not money. They were things like crops, food, livestock. And yams kind of grow near or underground. They grow year long. There's no particular harvesting season, so it was in theory, much more difficult for a state to tax individuals. Interesting, right? Kind of fascinating to me that the state may be a function of food, right? Anyway, those initial sort of organizations, those beginnings of civilizations, often we call them, those are the first real states. And with the development of a state comes the ability to grow further. Once you're able to tax, then you're able to pay money to do things. Well, what will you do if you're a state? Think of, just take Egypt, for example. What did they spend their money on? A lot of stuff, but armies and defense, and building monuments and temples, etc., but building infrastructure, buildings, sewage, roads, that sort of thing. those all build on each other. It's an example of a virtuous cycle. So, the more money you have, the more power you accrue. The more power you accrue, the more money you can get. It's a virtual cycle, a virtuous cycle that builds on itself, or in engineering terms, a positive feedback mechanism. All right. So, once states start to form, you get a whole bunch of states starting to form in competition with each other, because there's no way you can defend yourself without that level of organization. Now, that's the way it is for a long time in one form or another. I want to talk about the modern state, and for that, it's a big date in international relations theory, political science, comparative politics, and that's 1648. That is when the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, ends. It ends with the treaties of Westphalia, in which supposedly the modern state is born. Sovereignty is recognized. Sovereignty and borders are recognized. The state has the right to decide for itself what's going to happen inside of its own territory, as opposed to what? As opposed to what they had just fought 30 years about, which was essentially religion, the church in Europe. Okay, so the Roman Catholic Church, up until that point, claimed the right to tell what people to do inside of their own states. And with the treaties of Westphalia, the modern nation state, in theory at least, in Europe specifically, had that right for themselves. Okay, so that was a big change. Not cost-free. The 30 Years' War was pound for pound was the bloodiest war in European history. So pound for pound meaning, relative to the population at the time. Enormous percentages of people were killed or sickened or starved to death. That sort of thing. You had entire towns that were wiped out. It was quite common for 30-40% of the population of a city or a town to be lost. So this was a time of just massive upheaval. And again, one of the things it leads to is this creation of the modern state. So the creation of the modern state is in Europe. Why Europe? Why not China? Why not the Americas? Why not the Vikings? Why not the Islamic world? The creation of the modern state happens in Europe. Well, why? It depends on who you are and what you believe. There are different theories. So on the one hand, there's this sort of very conservative, far-right view that there's some kind of superiority to Western civilization. On the far left, there's the idea that it's just exploitation, hand in hand with the rise of global capitalism. In between, there's other theories. Agriculture hops back in. Jared Diamond's famous Guns, Germs, and Steel argues that it's a matter of geography, that Europe is long and kind of wide, giving it geographical variety, especially agricultural variety, and it's relatively dry as opposed to super humid and hot areas. So the variety is in the livestock. Instead of just growing sheep or just growing cattle or what have you, throughout Europe, inside of Europe, you'll have localities that will have more than one specialty. Why is that important? Well, if there's a disease that wipes out a herd, if all your cattle die, you can fall back on sheep or goats. In other parts of the world, generally a lot of regions will have like one category of livestock, and so when their herds are wiped out, then you have cataclysm. But your herd was able to survive this. Also, it's a little bit drier. Well, why does that matter? Well, you can store grain longer. The longer you can store grain, and other foods, the more food you'll have per person, you can grow your population, which is the key. Growing the population allows you to grow your society, grow your state. So it's things like that. And what happens once the modern state gets going, you see another virtuous cycle where increase in power leads to an increase in territory, leads to an increase in wealth. The increase in wealth leads to the ability to increase more power. Along the way, you're increasing your technology. Here's another theory why it happened in Europe as opposed to other places: competition. Europeans were stuck close to each other as they are now, and they famously fought each other throughout history, and so there was a competition. If your neighbor had an advance in technological capability, especially something like weaponry, then you had to acquire the same thing. So there was quick advances, but it's not a happy ending. Quick advances in order to, kill more of your neighbors, or to avoid being killed by your neighbors. So it's really advanced through brutality. And so that's from 1648 on is we've sort of set the template for what the modern nation state is going to be going forward. We're going to leave it at that, and I'll be back with another snippet on chapter 2, the final snippet on chapter 2, a bit later. Ta-ta for now.